Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CUNY School of Public Health's Grand Rounds. My name is Dr. Nevin Cohen, and I'm an associate professor in the Health Policy and Management Department, and I'm the director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute, which is sponsoring today's lecture. I'm really pleased to introduce my colleague, Professor Jessica Fanzo, climate professor and the director of the Food for Humanity initiative at the Columbia Climate School. Dr. Fanzo has been working at the intersection of food systems, climate, and public health for decades, with a particular focus on agriculture, health, and the environment, especially in countries facing climate challenges and limited resources. Jessica's work has taken her across sub-Saharan Africa and South and East Asia, where she's delved into diet diversity and quality nutrition and health outcomes and strategies for environmental sustainability and climate adaptation. Dr. Fanzo was awarded the Carasso Foundation's Sustainable Diets Prize in 2012 for her research on sustainable food and diets on long-term human health. She served as an advisor to key international organizations like the World Bank, WHO, USAID, IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, helping governments across the world develop food security strategies, especially in post-conflict regions. Currently, Dr. Fanzo leads several innovative projects, including the Food Systems Dashboard and the Food Systems Countdown to 2030 initiative. She was a leader in the EAT-Lancet Commission studies and contributes to other major global initiatives focused on nutrition and food systems. Before joining Columbia, Jessica was the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Global Food Policy and Ethics at Johns Hopkins and has held significant positions at the UN, Bioversity International, and other key organizations. We're really delighted that she has joined the Columbia faculty and that her office is now just down the street from our school. Dr. Fanzo was a co-investigator on an Urban Food Policy Institute project to create a food environment equity dashboard for New York City, and we hope to continue to collaborate on this work in the years ahead. Dr. Fanzo has a Ph.D. in nutrition from the University of Arizona and completed a postdoc fellowship in immunology at Columbia. Her scholarship and active engagement on food policy make her a leader in our efforts to address global food systems challenges. Before I turn the platform over to Dr. Fanzo, for today's lecture, I'd like to invite members of the audience to jot down your questions via the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll try to respond to as many of your questions as possible. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Jessica Fanzo. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nevin, for the invitation. And it's very nice to be here. And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in on a late Wednesday afternoon. And it's great to be near to CUNY. And I really do hope that we can work more together as two strong schools working on food and climate issues. So let me share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today with you about shining a light on food systems as a potential solution to the climate change agenda. So I'm going to start off first with some thoughts on why we need to change our food systems, why we need to transform them into positive directions. I think many of you know that we are in the middle of catastrophic climate breakdown. This is a graph from Ripple and colleagues and showing the state of climate. On the top are the 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. You can see the trends moving upwards. But there's a lot of other Earth system indicators that are going in the wrong directions. We see sea level rises. We see Arctic sea ice, Greenland ice mass, the Antarctic ice mass declining, as well as significant deforestation and heat rising, etc. So it's not a rosy picture when we look at the different trends across climate and not only its change, but the variability. So what does this mean for food systems? Well, climate change is and will continue to have impacts on our ability to grow food to feed the world. This is an interesting modeling project by Jonas Jägermeyer and colleagues here at Columbia, but also at NASA GISS, showing different yields of crops with in a scenario in which we really take no action on climate change. And it's showing you the latitudes in the world, and the yield changes is on the bottom. And you can see for the major crop commodities, maize, wheat, soybean, and rice, the differences in the yields. And maize overall, where it's grown most, which is shown in the gray, where maize is optimally grown, you can see significant declines in maize yields. Wheat is an interesting story in that where it's grown, you'll see potentially bumper crops or increased yields in the northern latitudes. Soybean, slightly negative or neutral impacts, and rice, again, somewhat neutral impacts. But this is problematic because we need to increase our yields of foods about 50% by 2050 to feed the growing population. So this is not a good picture, particularly for the global south, the southern hemisphere, which is very dependent on certain crops like maize. We also know that climate change will have impacts on the nutritional quality of crops. This is showing you across some major key commodities, the potential declines in iron and zinc, two nutrients that are essential for human health. And this map is showing you the places, because of this, what's called a CO2 fertilization effect, where you have more CO2 in the atmosphere, you could see potential decreases in iron and zinc, and the places on the map with the darker red showing you where this deficiency could be higher. So it's not only that yields could potentially decline across key crops, but the nutritional quality of those crops could also decline. We also know that food systems are vulnerable to shocks and multiple breadbasket failures. When we look at various shocks, be they climate and weather events, geopolitical or economic events, you could think of Ukraine-Russia crisis, the mismanagement and policy change, you can see along this map is showing you crops, livestock, fisheries, and aquaculture. This is the shock frequency of these commodities and where they impact a lot around the world. So you can see crops, the many shocks that are hitting Southern Asia, for example, livestock, East and Southern Asia, aquaculture hitting Southern Africa, places around Latin America. And it's not only where these shocks are happening, but the frequency of these shocks over time, where we see along the bottom across these major commodities, more frequency of shocks, more violent and volatile shocks happening around the world. And I think we've seen that just this past year. Climate-related extreme weather events are front and center. You know, we have floods in Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. We have wildfires in the western part of the United States and Canada. This is a picture showing you Greece, floods in Vermont even, heat. This is showing a picture in the southwestern part of the US, droughts in the Horn of Africa. Is the world prepared for these extreme weather events? And much of the data shows that this has been the hottest year on record and the hottest summer on record. And interestingly, it will probably be the hottest summer that it will be the coldest summer that you've experienced. So not only are we dealing with more and more heat, but the heat will get worse as we go along. So food systems are really struggling. They're constrained. And much of that has to do with what we call the 3 C's: climate change, the long tail of COVID, and conflict. And this is impacting what we call the 5 F's: food, finance, fuel, fertilizer to grow food, and fodder to feed animals. And this is impacting the outcomes that we want our food systems to achieve: food security, diet, nutrition, and health, environmental sustainability, and livelihoods. Now, I just showed you that food systems are victims of climate change, but they're also part of the problem. And I'll argue that they're also part of the solution later on. But food systems are contributors to climate change and global environmental degradation. We know that food systems are contributing about 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions around the world, the other coming from energy, building, transportation. And of this 30%, most of that is coming from production, agriculture production, and land use change. Less are coming from transportation and packaging of foods, still some, but not nearly as much as the way we produce our food and the land conversion. And most of that greenhouse gas emissions is coming from fertilizer application, methane from cattle digestion, enteric fermentation. These are ruminant animals like cows and sheep that burp a toxic greenhouse gas known as methane, but methane can also come from rice paddies, emissions from manure and pasture management, and on the land use side, mainly from deforestation. At the same time, agriculture is one of the largest drivers of biodiversity loss in both animal and plant species. Agriculture uses most of the freshwater resources on the planet, about 70%. And we know that many of the fish stocks, our blue foods, are limited or overfished in many parts of the world. But it's not all bad. There are 6 economies that emit about half of the world's food system greenhouse gases: China, Brazil, the US, India, Indonesia, and the EU. Now, if these six countries took significant action, we could drastically decrease the greenhouse gases being emitted from world's food systems. At the same time, our diets matter. Kind of diets we consume, our dietary patterns, have different greenhouse gas footprints. This is work coming from Brent Kim and colleagues at Johns Hopkins University, looking at across the United States. You can see here different dietary patterns and the kgs of carbon dioxide from those dietary patterns. And the different colors show you different food groups. So this bar on the left is your typical omnivorous diet. You consume beef, you consume dairy, you consume pork, and you consume other fruits and veg and legumes, nuts and seeds. And you can see the greenhouse gas equivalence of the diet. Now, just compare this to a whole range of other dietary patterns. Here's, for example, pescatarian diet. At the very end here is a vegan diet, no animal source foods, no dairy. And you can see the differences in these greenhouse gases coming from diet. So the kind of diet we consume also matters for climate change and environmental sustainability. Another reason, though, we need to transform our food systems is that people are also not the healthiest. Our food systems are not feeding us well. Diets are now one of the top risk factors of disease and death in the world. A lot of that has to do with these highly processed and packaged foods, or what are called ultra-processed foods. These are foods high in sugar, salts, and unhealthy fats, and lots of other ingredients that are difficult to recognize to keep these foods on the shelves for long periods of time, to change their color, enhance their flavor. And what this graph is showing you is across different regions, the sales of these ultra-processed foods from 2006 to 2024. And you can see the growth of these foods, and you see the same with beverages. These foods are tasty, they're cheap to make, they're cheap to purchase, they stay on shelves a long time, they're easily traded across oceans, And this growth of these foods is being shown more and more in the literature to contribute to poor health outcomes. Now, what this all means is that we see malnutrition as being something that's universal and worsening. So when you look at these statistics, I'm still always blown away by them. We have 735 million people who go to bed hungry. We have 148 million children under the age of 5 who are chronically undernourished or stunted. That's about 23% of the world's children. It's incredible. So the burden of countries dealing with these high stunting prevalences is challenging and doesn't allow for them to get on a path towards sustainable development. We have 45 million children under the age of 5 who are acutely malnourished or wasted. This number largely has not changed as long as I've been a nutritionist, and I've been a nutritionist a long time. 37 million children under the age of 5 are overweight, really kind of unheard of 30 years ago. And 2.2 billion adults are overweight and obese. And what this map here on the right shows is the number of people in food security crisis. Never before has this map been so lit up with people in desperate need for food. And again, it has a lot to do with the 3 C's: climate, COVID, and conflict. But more and more, there is this call of transforming food systems for both human health and planetary health. We've seen some political momentum on this area. We've seen a lot of reports and guidelines on how we can transform our food systems and ensure that they are not only producing food that's healthy for us, but is environmentally sustainable and climate resilient. But there's a lot to do. We need more investment and more significant attention to the issue. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk also about this EAT-Lancet report. That was quite a moment in time that drew attention to this idea that how does our world produce healthy diets from sustainable food systems, and what should be the targets for that? And I'll come back to that in a minute. But transforming food systems is not easy. This is not a very pretty graph of food systems. In this middle gray box are the components of food systems: food supply chains. Food's produced, it's stored, it's processed, it's packaged, it's transported to markets. We are individuals who engage in the food system. We bring with us our information and knowledge, our desires and values and aspirations, our situational context. And we engage in the food system in what we call these food environments. This is the places every day where you shop or order food. What kind of food is available in these places? Is the food affordable? What are the product properties, the quality, the appeal, the convenience? What's the vendor property? All of these attributes are influencing our diets, our choices of what we buy, and the quantity and quality and diversity of our diets. Now, again, we're asking our food systems to do a lot. We want them to have environmental outcomes, better nutrition and health, better livelihoods, fair and equitable livelihoods, and we want them to be equitable and just. But there's many drivers here on the left that are influencing food systems and pulling them and shaping them in different positive and negative directions, be it urbanization, politics, population growth and migration, globalization and trade, conflict. All of these drivers are shaping our food systems. And these systems are incredibly dynamic. There's many actors, there's many activities. So transforming this so it works for everyone is a grand challenge that we need to deal with. Now, I'm going to bring up 3 issues that I think limit food system transformation, and then we'll start talking about where are some potential solutions. So one of the first ethical conundrums that we face is, Should some countries or individuals make larger changes to their diets to benefit the whole of society? Take a look at this graph. This is showing you animal source food consumption across different countries. We know that energy-intensive lifestyles and dietary choices, particularly of those living in high-income countries, are significant anthropogenic contributors to climate change. Look at the United States and the amount of meat consumption compared to places like Kenya, Cambodia, Senegal, Ethiopia. There's a real inequity here about who gets access to animal source foods, but also who has a heavier global footprint through their diets. Now, the EAT-Lancet Commission tried to argue that if we go towards more plant-based diets, we would not only be healthier as humans, but we'd have a lower environmental footprint. So if you look at this diet, it's mainly made up of fruits and veg, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and less dairy and animal source foods and sugars. But when we look at places around the world, here is the health boundary, the EAT-Lancets in this hatched orange line. And you can see the global level, people are consuming way more meat than they need to and way more starches. And here's eggs. And not enough of the healthy stuff, the fruits, veg, legumes, nuts, and seeds, not even meeting the boundary for that. Here's North America. We eat a lot of meat and potatoes, beef, overextending, starchy staples, eggs, poultry, dairy. Now look at sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of starchy staples, staying within the boundaries for meat and not getting enough of the healthy stuff. So what this shows is just the massive inequities of who gets access to what kinds of foods. And we know that inequities are deepening. This is a map showing you the percentage of the population who cannot afford what is considered a healthy diet. That is, one that meets nutritional needs and is health protective. So the darker brown is that percentage of population where you see 75 to 100% of the population can't afford a healthy diet. 3.1 billion people in the world cannot afford to do so. Isn't that incredible? It's just a staggering statistic. So almost half the world cannot even eat a basic nutritious diet. The other big ethical conundrum we face is, how do we best use finite resources when we still have hunger around the world? So what this graph is showing you, this is from a new UNEP report, What's Cooking, and it shows about 40 to 50% of the Earth's surface is used to grow food, used for agriculture. Now, of that, about 77%, 75% is raising livestock. The rest, the 25%, is for plant crops. Of that livestock and dairy, they're only providing about 18% of calories and about 37% of protein, whereas plants are providing the majority of the calories and protein. So the question is this the best use of a finite resource, that being land, to grow food? Is that efficient? Now we can argue, well, we can just expand. Well, we actually can't. There's not a lot more arable land where we can grow food. But where you do see expansion is in forestscapes. So we're seeing significant tropical deforestation around the world. And most of that is being driven by livestock, beef. You see it in the Amazon, you see it in the Congo Basin, and the second being oil seeds, palm and soybean. And this is devastating, not only for the rich biodiversity that these forestscapes house, but also we're removing these carbon sinks that these forests are so important for. So we can't extensify out and grow more food into more land. What you see more is a trend of deforestation into these very rich nutrient areas that is quite devastating, not only for the biodiversity, but for climate mitigation. The third ethical conundrum we face is who shapes and governs food systems. Now, when you look at this graph, we've got 1.5 billion farmers, and we've got 8.1 billion eaters. And what you see across supply chains, the traders, the processors, the retailers, we see this massive consolidation and concentration of just a handful of companies that are controlling the supply chains. We also see it at the front end of the supply chain. The seed companies, the agrochemical companies, is also a massive concentration and consolidation. And this concentration of these transnational food and agri companies, they're well coordinated, they have a lot of political and economic power, and it makes it very difficult for governments to govern them and regulate them. This is a huge issue when we talk about food system, of who's governing our food systems, who's shaping them in positive directions for public health, environment, and climate for the citizens of the world. And that is a big political quagmire that is left to be resolved, of how we deal with this power asymmetry that we see in food systems. This is just showing you the share of the top 4 firms, or what they call CR4, for selected US commodities, food processing, and retail channels. And you really see, again, a lot of consolidation. For example, beef processing, JBS, Marfrig, these are 2 Brazilian companies that control almost half of beef processing in the world. 4 companies control about 75% of beef processing. And you can look across the board, you see significant consolidation and control across different commodities and different supply chain elements of our food system. So how do we ensure inclusive diets within planetary boundaries? How do we start to make food systems start working for better human and planetary health? Well, I'm gonna bring up 2 points on this slide. The first is that if we do nothing in food systems, we stay on a business as usual course, we will not meet the Paris climate change target set out in 2015 to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We fix energy, we fix buildings, we fix transportation, we still will not stay below 1.5 if we do nothing on food. The second point is that we need to do many things, multi-level food system action, if we want to stay below 1.5. So what this graph is showing you, this line down here is a 70% chance of staying below 1.5. But we need to improve the efficiency on farms, better sustainable management practices. We need to increase yields in some parts of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, but it still won't get us there. So agriculture is not the only answer. We also need to fix our diets. We need to move towards plant-dominant diets. Eat a healthy amount of calories, what you need, not overconsume. It gets us there somewhat, but not completely. We also need to cut food loss and waste in half. Gets us there somewhat, but not completely. This last bar graph is showing you the combination of these gives us a fighting chance to stay below 1.5 degree. So it's not one silver bullet. It's many things that need to happen. And here's just some interventions that we can do across food systems in production, diversifying foodscapes, growing more crops, different crops, fruits and veg, legumes, nuts, and seeds, not just a handful of staple commodities like sugar, maize, and soy. We need to give farmers crop insurance. We need to invest in technology where appropriate. And we need to change our subsidy policies or reorient them to promote nutritious crops. On processing and transportation, we need to reformulate our foods to get them healthier through food processing. We need governments to set standards of minimizing the amount of salt, fat, and sugars in foods, fortify when appropriate, and promote cold chain storage and transport for those nutritious, perishable foods that often don't get to the last mile. We need to improve our food environments where people shop every day, make it easier for people to make choices that fit with their life, but that are also healthy and sustainable. And that means taxing unhealthy foods, subsidizing healthy foods, removing barriers to access, reaching youth through school meal programs, farm to school programs, school gardens, and promoting community cohesion and social justice through community gardens and community farms. And last, ensuring that we've got stronger labels that are easy for people to understand so they can make the choices that fit with their lifestyle, limiting advertising and food marketing to children, and mass media campaigns to help keep the public informed on often confusing messages. So let me highlight a few areas, and these are broad and macro, but we can talk about them during the discussion. So we need to provide adaptation support and tools for food system actors. Now, there's estimates that 4.5 billion people work in food systems, formally or informally, directly or indirectly. So banks are often included in that because they finance farmers. But smallholder farmers, those living on less than 20 hectares, produce about 75% of the food that feeds sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. That's a big population, those three regions. And they produce roughly somewhere between half to about 80% of the micronutrients in those places. And the reason is because they have very diverse farmscapes. But they need support. Many of these smallholder farmers are food insecure. They are poor. They're living in sometimes extreme poverty. So governments and other private sector actors need to give smallholder farmers more tools and information to help them adapt so they can continue to grow this diverse food basket for the world. For the large-scale actors, we need to incentivize or regulate them to produce nutritious, sustainable, cheap, and convenient foods. So cheap and convenient is the key piece for the consumer, but they should be nutritious and sustainable. We need to incentivize and regulate some of these large-scale actors to minimize their production of these ultra-processed foods. And of course, youth are critical to this equation. As many of you probably know, the average age of the world's farmer is 62. Who's going to grow our food in the future when more and more people are leaving rural areas and moving to urban centers? Where are we going to grow the food? Who's going to grow the food and how? It's a big question. Now, I want to emphasize this idea of diverse landscapes. When we think about the kind of foods we consume, there's something in the order of about 5,000 crops that could be used for food by humans. But 3 crops, rice, corn, and wheat, provide about 50% of the world's calories. 12 crops, that's rice, corn, wheat, potatoes, soy, and some animal species, provide about 75% of the world's food. Now, this leaves the food system incredibly vulnerable, climate vulnerable, nutritionally vulnerable. And we saw that play out when Ukraine and Russia went to war. 2 big bread baskets. In Ukraine, the flag is the sky and the gold is wheat. What happened when they went to war was a significant shock to the global food system. Food prices skyrocketed along with food inflation. And it just showed how dependent the world is on not only 2 major breadbasket countries that go to war, but 1 or 2 commodities, that being wheat and safflower oil. So we need to be thinking about relying on many more countries to grow many more types of food. And we saw that also play out during COVID. The other thing we need to think about is promoting stronger governance of food environments and actors to ensure better access and information for eaters. Things like taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages and unhealthy foods, ensuring that every country has a food-based dietary guideline. Only about 90 countries have that, which those guidelines can help set government programs. 85 countries have a school meal program. These are all the areas where we can ensure that we can scale these up and have food environments that are friendly to consumers. So we need to increase this access to ensure that there's diverse and nutritious food at the local levels and in public institutions, be it in schools, hospitals, prisons. We need to introduce regulations to industry and disincentivize unhealthy and unsustainable foods, and raise awareness, provide more information that's easy to understand for consumers to be able to consume a healthy and sustainable diet. The choice architecture of food environments where you shop every day. This is an incredibly opportunistic place to make big change, not only ensuring that there's healthy food that's accessible, that there's food that's sustainable, but ensuring that it's easy to access for consumers. So this is an area of research that's growing in the nutrition and public health field of how do we improve the choice architecture of these food environments where people engage every day with the food system. The third thing we need to do is incentivize changes on the demand side towards healthy diets. Now, what this graph is showing you over here on the left, sorry, this text shouldn't be there yet, is showing you human and environmental health indicators. So environmental on the right side, human health on the left side, and this is work by Mike Clark and colleagues, and showing that fruits and veg, whole grains and olive oil are healthy and environmentally sustainable. When we move to nuts and legumes and refined grains, you see a little bit of touch points on some health, a little bit of touch points on some environmental stresses, but where you really see more impacts on environmental stress and negative human health implications is around red and processed meat. This is a really important message for people who are eating every day, which is all of us, in that there's some foods that are higher risk for human health, but also have compounded impacts on the environment. So looking at the kinds of diets that people can consume are important to understand. And we know that even just small changes, and this is substituting 10% of daily calorie intake from beef and processed meats and substituting that for plant-based foods and seafood, provides health improvements and reduces the carbon footprint of the diet by 33%. And this was work done in the United States showing this. This is the health benefit. You can just look at this dark line, the dark blue line, and showing the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So you don't have to become a vegan. You can make small changes to your diet that could have significant impacts both on your health as well as the environment. And one area that is still a big question mark is the growth of alternative proteins. That could be cultivated meats, more the plant-based meats, fermented meats, insects, and there's massive growth. Look at this, $8 billion of investment across many countries, the US being the biggest investor in these alt proteins, and a whole range of products from seafood, eggs, meat, dairy, you name it. So this is a huge area of investment, but most of this research is locked into venture capital. And those of us in public research institutions don't really get access to a lot of the information of these products, so we can't really study them. But UNEP put out a report trying to understand the potential impacts of these different foods on environment and health. And you see quite significant benefits on the environment across a range of indicators on greenhouse gas emissions, land and water use, biodiversity. But on the health side, if you look at the very bottom, you see gray, more research needed on the nutritional quality and dietary and health outcomes of these products. We just don't have enough information to be able to say whether or not these are benefiting or detrimental to human health. Now, we've done a little bit of work in the US, and one thing that's interesting is that when Americans are making choices about food, they don't always consider human health and the environment. And this is looking at a whole range of different values: price over here, taste, health, animal welfare, convenience, quality, environmental sustainability. You just look at environmental sustainability, is not a lot of importance stressed on that when making choices around purchasing meat, as compared to price and taste and health. So it's a mixed bag when we think about how do we engage consumers when making choices about sustainable diets. What do they value? What do they care about? What are the attributes that they're looking for when they're shopping for foods? We also did an interesting study where we asked participants to sort 42 food items. We didn't tell them how, just sort them, by color, by texture, by food group, what have you. And of course, Americans typically sorted these foods by food group. But interestingly, what you see is that they were able to sort the meats, they were able to sort dairy. What they couldn't sort were some of these more newer foods: plant-based milk, Impossible Burger, in vitro meat. Well, I couldn't sort ramen noodles either. What are ramen noodles? But it's interesting. It's a little bit of a intel on how people are thinking about these foods. So could there be issues down the road in the acceptability of these foods as they become more mainstreamed and available? Maybe one other thing, and I won't go through this whole table, but also on the beef side, if we were to shift away from beef, now we saw that there was potential benefits for greenhouse gases and human health, but there are impacts on livelihoods. When we shift away from livelihoods where people are employed in the beef sector, live cattle or beef processing, and we move towards the alternative protein space, a 10% substitution, a 30 or 60% substitution, we see, again, a reduction in the carbon footprint of the US food agriculture, but reducing, and we also see a big reduction in the number of animals needed for beef production, somewhere between 2 and 12 million. But we also see a massive contraction in the cattle and beef processing sector, somewhere between 7 and 45%, with about 1.2 million jobs lost in the beef sector if it were to contract and the US were to move much more towards plant-based beef substitutes or alternatives. So maybe in my last couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about the last area, which is improving national food system decision-making. So I hope you agree that we need to transform our food systems, and it's an urgent agenda that we need to undertake. But to transform food systems, policymakers need information. They're often in the dark on how their food systems are performing, what are the potential near and long-term risks, and where and how to intervene. So we've been doing a lot of work on developing better data and data systems to help policymakers make evidence-based decisions. And Nevin is doing one for New York, a food systems dashboard. We have a one that's a more global level, but not as interesting as Nevin's, which pulls together a lot of data from around the world. And you can look at different food systems. Almost every country is represented. There's country profiles, there's maps and tables. So I encourage you, if you are interested in playing with data in visually appealing ways, to go to this foodsystemsdashboard.org. And you can see there's mapping tools and tables across a whole variety of food system indicators. But one of the things we just released is a report and a complementary paper called the Food Systems Countdown to 2030 Initiative, in which it's an interdisciplinary collaboration of 65 scientists across every region of the world from 32 organizations. And it's been a 3-year process in which we got this group aligned into these 5 working groups around diets, nutrition and health, environment, natural resources and production, livelihoods, and then 2 cross-cutting areas of governance and resilience. And we had these groups map out what are the best indicators we have to monitor food systems around the world. And after a long period of selection of indicators, we came up with these 50 indicators across these 5 areas that the world can monitor to track food system performance. And let me just show you, let me blow this up. So here's an example. Here's the diets, nutrition, and health. I figured this group would be interested in seeing this. These are the suite of indicators that we're tracking. And what this shows is less desirable on the left side, more desirable on the right side, low-income countries in light blue to high-income countries in dark blue. And you can see where the world sits. So for example, the percentage of the population that cannot afford a healthy diet, this third one, low-income countries versus high-income countries is quite different. You can see low-income countries is less desirable, high-income countries more desirable. But on the other hand, soft drink consumption, ultra-processed food sales, you can see in high-income countries is much less desirable. You can also look at the country level, but at the regional level of these different indicators. And again, let me blow this up. Here you can see some indicators, and it's showing you, for example, ultra-processed food sales are actually the highest in the South Pacific area, and North America is being less desirable. Access to safe drinking water, less desirable for sub-Saharan Africa. So looking at all of these indicators gives you a picture of how food systems are performing around the world. And what we learned is that no single region or single country in the world has a monopoly on food system success or food system challenges. Every region has significant room for improvement, and countries can learn from each other. And that's really important because you often hear this dichotomy of high-income countries do really well, low-income countries are struggling, and that's just not the case. We know that without monitoring food systems, it's going to be really hard to transform them because you just won't know where or how to transform food systems if you're not measuring them and where they're doing well and where they're not. That said, we have a lot of gaps in data. We don't have a lot of real-time data, and I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A. When shocks hit food systems, it's very hard to measure how food systems respond to those shocks. So we need always more and better data that is particularly data in real time. I just want to end with, I haven't presented all the research that we do, but we've got lots of collaborators around the world that we work with. Here's just a few that particularly here you can see the countdown group that has been engaged in this whole process. Here's some of my funding resources just so you can see those. And I just want to thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Jessica. This was a wonderful presentation. We have questions that are posted in the Q&A, but please, those of you in the audience, if you have a question, please just type it in and we'll try to get to it. I'll take the prerogative of being the moderator to ask you the first question, and it's a bit of a devil's advocate question, but the EAT-Lancet report, which recommended dietary changes for planetary health, has been criticized for not considering the equity impacts, particularly the first cost, the initial cost of healthier diets, and then you mentioned the effect on the production sector in New York State. We just had a report that there were about 2,000 fewer dairy farms in upstate New York, and dairy farmers think that the switch to non-dairy milk alternatives is part of that challenge that they're facing. Could you comment on the equity aspects of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the EAT-Lancet is controversial, and I think for several reasons. It set out scientific targets, and the minute you set out a target, you're open to criticism. And I'm my own worst critic, and I've talked about this a lot publicly, that in the first EAT-Lancet Commission, and I'll talk about the second one in a second, we really did not address anything on justice and equity issues. There was a couple of papers that came out after arguing that the EAT-Lancet diet was unaffordable, particularly those who were living in poverty or below the $1.90 poverty line around the world. And interestingly, the EAT-Lancet diet is low in animal source foods. Animal source foods are expensive in many parts of the world. So it's interesting, Nevin, because even the fresh fruits and veg, legumes, nuts, and seeds, that basis of the EAT-Lancet diet still remains unaffordable. Imagine adding a little bit more animal source foods. It would be very expensive in some places in the world, like sub-Saharan Africa. We didn't really, also in the EAT-Lancet, we didn't go into the cost of all this. What is it going to cost to transform the food system? Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? Who's going to be left behind with this transformation that the world is trying to make? And we really ignored the issue of women's empowerment. Many women are growing food around the world, they're cooking food around the world, and that was not really considered. There is a new EAT-Lancet Commission 2.0, and this has a significant portion that will be looking at the justice implications. So we have a whole new group that's come in to look at the potential distributive justice issues and what happens to livelihoods, what happens to populations that can't afford this grand transformation that the call is the crying rally call. So there's a much more deep look at the justice implications. But I have to say, Nevin, I think with all of these changes, and we know this historically with some countries, some communities, some individuals have to make bigger shifts by choice or forced. And that's going to be really difficult to understand and rectify and figure out how to protect some of those populations. So it's not an easy to call for these food system transformations. It's easy to say that, but it's so much harder to do in reality for governments, because someone at the end of the day is going to lose in this. And how do we protect those who are most vulnerable and marginalized already from being on the losing end of this? So that's the really key thing, is to understand who those people are and protect them as much as we can.
Thank you. Thanks. And to follow up, Ali Weiner asks, where do you see opportunities for climate mitigation in the U.S. food system, given the current lack of political will? And she adds, you mentioned aligning school lunch standards with climate goals. Do you have any suggestions for how we can change this now or in the short term?
School meals, I don't know, because I don't really work in the U.S. context, but I think in the U.S. overall, I mean, a lot of these issues when it comes time to food and climate get quickly, they quickly unravel into cultural wars and political wars. But, you know, when we look at the US trends, beef consumption has been coming down over the last 30, 40 years significantly. The diets of my parents when they were growing up are very different than the diets that many of us consume now. So change happens, you know, and I think a lot of that beef reduction came from cardiovascular disease upticks and the health system stepping in, a lot of doctors arguing that their patients had to change their diets and move away from high amounts of saturated fats and beef. So I think there's change happens. I think it's happening in the US. You know, we hear a bit of the outliers of people fighting and saying that, you know, don't make me stop eating my burgers. But I do think that behaviors changed a lot in the US. Diets have changed significantly. There's also lots of tactics around nudging. That's what these alt meats are for. You know, the burgers that look, bleed, smell, taste like meat, but are not meat, are for those meat consumers. And I think it's not so much on the alt protein side of mimicking burgers, where I think it's really going to be a potential game changer is in all the made meals that have meat in them. Take your frozen lasagna that's got meat in it. If we have alt meats in those, you know, this is the kind of nudging where people don't really know.
Mhm.
It's used as condiment and flavoring. That's where I think we could see a massive change, is in all of these meal products where meat is supplementing for flavor, and being able to nudge people in that direction of just replacing those could be something that could be quite powerful in reducing the greenhouse gas footprint. So I think there's the kind of the nudging piece, but then I don't think we should take light that diets have significantly changed and people's behaviors really are malleable and they change. Remember, Nevin, when we were growing up and the switch to skim milk? And we thought we could never change to skim milk and now like when you were to drink whole milk, it tastes like thick, you know, it's hard to drink it. So these things happen over time. People change their behaviors.
We had a couple of questions about the difference between the alt meat trend and regenerative farming. And could you comment? So it's framed as the debate between moving towards alt meat versus moving towards regenerative farming. And what's the evidence about either approach?
Yeah. So regenerative farming, like what they call, well, it's a little bit different, but Europe uses the term agroecology. I think we need all of that. And we need better on-farm sustainable management practices that provide ecosystem services. But we also are going to need tech. And I think a lot of the rhetoric you hear when we start to talk about food system transformation, everyone's looking at that one thing. You know, is it regenerative? Is it organic? Is it millets? Is it fortification? Is it alt proteins? It's all of it. We're going to need to make big changes, and it's going to be very specific to the context and the culture of where these food systems sit. Not everywhere in the world is going to be regenerative agriculture. It's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we're not going to everywhere in the world remove livestock. There's places in the world where livestock is incredibly important for culture and tradition. Not everywhere in the world's going to eat alt proteins, right? So we need to be thinking about multiple solutions that are appropriate for the context and the cultures in where people live and how they grow their food. Mm-hmm. So we need a whole range of solutions. I think regenerative, it's been around a long time, since the 70s. I think there's more evidence needed about how regenerative can be scaled, get, you know, high yields, not be so labor intensive. We need to be looking at some of these issues around regenerative. but I think it's one potential solution of managing landscapes as a whole other range of different kinds of mechanisms to do that. It's the one discussed a lot in the US though, but yeah.
Right. Thanks. We have a few questions about food governance. One related to dashboards specifically. Have you seen movements from policymakers by providing them more data and data dashboards? And a related question, how and by whom should food systems be monitored, and what leverage would the monitors have in creating change?
Good questions.
Do the dashboards have an effect, and who would be involved in monitoring?
So our dashboard, I would say it's had well, researchers love it, which was not our intended audience, but they do like it, and they like to just download the data and play with it themselves. But governments, we have had a lot of interest, particularly in some countries like in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Bangladesh, Indonesia, so much so that they like the dashboard, but it's all at the national level. It doesn't really help them a lot. So like Nevin, what you're developing, the New York City one, is much more relevant. So some of these countries have started developing subnational dashboards, district level dashboards, because then it allows for them to understand where some of the problems are at a more localized level. So we've had some interest there. The dashboards also just, it has become sort of an advocacy, accountability kind of mechanism in which in some of the countries where we've workshopped the dashboard, we look at some of the big challenges in those countries. Like maybe it's obesity, or maybe it's significant greenhouse gases coming from agriculture. And using the dashboard, we start to walk back from obesity. Well, what's driving that obesity? What is it in the food system that we think is happening? So it allows for problem solving through data. Through a data lens. So countries have been using that. There's something called the UN Food System Summit that happened in 2021, where many countries have signed up to transform their food systems. And the countdown work we're hoping is used as a monitoring as these countries map out their transformation pathways. And not all countries will find it useful, but we hope that some do. What the second question was on?
Who should monitor the food systems?
Yes. Well, I think it's researchers, if they can stay objective, to provide that data. The best quality, the least biased kind of data possible. But I think the most important user are policymakers, departments or ministries, which can take that data and use it to not only take action, but also hold private sector actors to account. So to me, governments have the most utility in being able to use that data and be able to take action on it. Yeah, that's who I would say is probably maybe not the most powerful actor, but probably the most important actor that needs to really understand the state of their food systems, how they're performing, what they need to do, what kind of actions they can take, and then start working with the different actors that are working in their countries to be able to hold them to account.
That's really valuable. We got a couple of questions about corporations, and one is you noted an important question about who shapes and governs food systems and the challenges posed by the influence of transnational food corporations. Where would you see areas of alignment between the transnational corporations and positive development outcomes? And the other question is, where do you see opportunities for people to work in food systems besides government? Are there any businesses that address the issues you've talked about directly or indirectly?
Yeah. So on alignment, I mean, the private sector is huge, right? There's small enterprises to very transnational, and they all play roles and they all do positive and negative things across food systems. I mean, small and medium enterprises feed something like 70% of Africa. So, and farmers are private sector. So I think on alignment, if you are a private sector actor, your main goal is to make money. You're making a profit. So the key thing to ask to private sector is, where can you make money and have positive public health outcomes and positive environmental sustainability outcomes? Where's that triple win or sweet spot where they can do all three? So we don't want to tell them you need to stop making profit, because that's just not going to happen, right? They're gonna continue to make profits that they have to answer to their boards. So where is that spot? Where does that alignment happen? And some companies are making bigger strides towards that triple win than others. There's some companies that don't care at all. And then there's some companies that are trying. It's challenging though. It's definitely hard to get the three wins together.
Mhm.
I think though more and more companies are deeply concerned about the environment and climate in the food space, because they're so reliant on the sourcing of their ingredients. And if there's lots of natural disasters and decimations of multiple breadbasket failures, that hits their bottom line. So I think there's deep concern about climate change and the environment, and many companies have environmental goals. Where you don't see a lot of action is on the public health side. A lot of it's blaming consumers, putting it on the backs of consumers. Like, we give them healthy choices, but they choose to eat poorly. You hear that kind of sentiment. So you don't see, every once in a while, you see some small portion of their portfolio working on public health, but I think we need to do a lot more and a lot more regulating on the public health side. You see some companies reformulating, but it's not really getting us that far. So I think there could be a lot more work done on the public health side. The second part, Nevin, was, I mean, there's a whole range of private sector actors that are doing really great stuff though, too, and interesting places to work. I think there's a lot of new tech companies and companies deeply concerned about climate, deeply concerned about the healthfulness of our food supply. So I think there's a whole range of really fascinating actors in the space, and then some that are bad actors that have created a lot of mistrust of corporations. But if for those of you who are looking for careers in private sector, just do your homework. Know where you're going, know their mission, and how much of their portfolio is actually going towards the things that you care about as in the company that you want to work for.
And we have actually a question from someone who's working in the field, but as a reporter, Aeneas Eljubadani, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, who is in Canada. And she asks, is there something we as journalists should stop doing when reporting on the topic of food systems? Or the converse is, what should we be focusing on?
Such a good question. I mean, I feel that I like what sometimes when you see articles where they've gotten opinions from multiple sources, multiple researchers. Sometimes you'll see like a paper highlighted, and they're talking about that paper and the group that's published that paper. But I think it's always good to get multiple sources and opinions of that paper to give sort of a more balanced view. Because sometimes things hit the news, and you're like, that study really made the news. And I think it's good to ask multiple sources. And I think, I mean, of the news outlets I choose to read, they're a pretty high quality most of the time. I think those of us in research probably need to get better media training of how we speak to reporters. Only talk about what you know, not what not your opinions.
Mhm.
So I think these kind of multiple sourcing around these complex topics, multiple um, um, opinions of certain research that comes out is important to gather. Yeah, such a great question though.
We have a question from Catherine Schwartz. Any suggestions of what we should advocate for in the next Farm Bill?
Oh boy.
Um,
Subsidy pump. No, I'm kidding. Uh, so many things. I mean, the school meals one's always a big one, right? Improving the school meal programs across the US. I don't know enough about SNAP to really talk about it coherently. To me, the biggest issue in my world is the subsidy policies of the United States, but incredibly difficult, very very intractable political issue to change subsidy policies, but they're in dire need of changing. So I would advocate for reorienting our subsidy policies overall. But it's incredibly difficult to do that. It's a really uphill battle in the United States, particularly.
mhm, mhm. Amelia Gelnet from the New York State Food as Medicine Coalition wanted to know of the varieties of agricultural production that are essential to reducing carbon emissions. You mentioned agroforestry, regenerative agriculture, crop diversity, rotation, no-till agriculture, et cetera. What percentage of our food system production could be shifted to those practices to
That I
contain
don't know.
deforestation and create healthier?
That I don't know. Not the right yeah, it's a great question, but one fantastic question actually, but one I couldn't answer.
Mhm,
It's really, yeah, I think you have to really have a deep understanding of the limits to the different agro ecosystems of the US, and I couldn't answer that. And it's a
mhm.
great question though.
And maybe we need more data to really be able to
Yeah.
figure that out and keep track of that. So uh, an audience member asked, if you found a magic lamp and were given 3 wishes to create new data sets to measure food systems globally, what would they be? Are there any
Oof.
data that are missing that we need to track globally?
Yeah. I think we need better diet. So outside the United States, US is pretty good at this, but and I work more on low and middle income settings. We need better dietary data. We really don't know what people are eating around the world and how they make those choices. Most of the diet data that you see is modeled data. So we really need more nationally representative dietary data. I think the second area is how food systems respond to shocks. We don't really have a lot of information about how food supplies respond to choke points, compound events, trade shocks. Like, for example, when the Ukraine-Russia crisis hit, we were really trying to figure out what was happening with food supplies, as Russia was starting to block grains moving. And what did that mean for food prices? What kind of foods were moving? Which countries are starting to export or ban their exports? We weren't getting that in real time. So the movement and trade of food with shocks that have implications regionally or globally, I wish we had better data around that. Gaza, very hard to know what's happening in Gaza from a food security perspective as this shock has happened. This tragic thing has happened. So what's going on with the food situation in Gaza? It's very hard to figure that out. I would say the third area might be around such food environments. We don't really understand the kinds of food environments that people are exposed to, what those food the kinds of foods being sold in these food environments. To me that really gets to kind of the access issue, people's physical and economic access to food, the food environment space. And we know it more in the US, but in low and middle income countries, very huge dearth of how people access food. What are their local food environments? We have very little information on that. This is just a handful of men. I could go on and on about this, Nevin. Carbon footprints of certain foods and the way they're grown, how they're grown. We have these very aggregate levels like beef, greenhouse gas emissions, but there's some beef that's more sustainably grown, lower greenhouse gas footprint. So we don't have that real detailed landscape level kind of data.
Well, I hope that this in particular is a conversation that we will continue because we're both interested in data systems and improving our understanding of key food system elements. Yeah. And I want to thank you for this very broad presentation of challenges and opportunities. We're at about time, and so I wanted to give you the opportunity, if you wanted to say any final words to everybody here, and then want to make sure that the audience knows that we're going to make this presentation available on the CUNY SPH website, perhaps the CUNY YouTube website, and we hope that there'll be future opportunities for you, Jessica, to come back to CUNY and interact with us. Any final words or thoughts or?
No, I mean, I just really appreciate the opportunity, and I just hope that all of those that are working in the public health space be thinking about not only health systems but food systems and how important they are to improving public health outcomes for people around the world. So thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you, and thank you, Paolo, for organizing this, and thanks to the Dean's Office for sponsoring these grand rounds. Thanks everybody for attending, and I look forward to you coming to the next Urban Food Policy Institute Forum. Stay tuned, and if you're not signed up for our newsletter, please send us an email or go to our website and sign up, and we hope to engage with you next month. Thanks. Take care.